Welcome, good thinkers, to Good Thinking Live. If you're here right at the top of the hour, let us know who you are and where you're from. That's the fun part. And this is going to be, again, very interactive. And we've got an incredible guest that is going to give you new ways of thinking about decision making that maybe you've never really thought of before. Maybe you have, but you have to bring all your great questions. So let us know who you are and where you're from. And I am going to bring our guest, Michael Knouse, in from the green room. All right, let's bring him in. This is the official entree. Hi, Michael.
Hi, Becky.
Welcome. Good morning.
Good morning.
We're West Coast, U.S. West Coasters, so it's 9 a.m. here, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time everywhere. So that's when we're usually here on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live. And we are starting to get some good thinkers in the house. So we've got Jennifer Felberg is here from Oregon. We've got Michael Morovitz is here. Happy Spring Form from Toronto. Is it spring? It's spring.
It's spring.
I think it's spring. Happy spring. All right. Well, welcome, good thinkers. And as you're coming on, we're going to take your questions and we're going to probe deep into Michael's background to get all the best nuggets for great decision making. We've got someone from Hungary. And I'm going to mispronounce I'm horrible at pronouncing Polish names, but Wojciech from Poland. And we have got Stephen from the state home to 2 NCAA Sweet 16 qualifiers, basketball. So, and then and it says, from Milan. So we've got some great people from all over. And sorry, when it says LinkedIn, sometimes it says LinkedIn user in the chat, but later when it comes up in LinkedIn, I'll see who you are and I can greet you by name. If you put your name in the chat, then I can tie the LinkedIn user to the name. And we have Mukesh from India. We have Serhat from Istanbul. Oh, Wojciech. All right, that's great. Wojciech. I love that. Give me the phonetic pronunciation. That is fantastic. So we are starting to we've got Paul Allen. Hello, Paul. Anyway, welcome. Definitely let us know who you are and where you're from. And if I say LinkedIn user, sorry, it just means, or YouTube user, it just means you have to tell me. And we've got, let's see, how are you? Mukesh, we are great. We're going to get started. Can I brag on you for a little bit first, Michael?
Sure, go for it.
All right, I'm going to brag on Michael. All right, before I do, how many of you, because Michael's done a lot of cool things, but how many of you know what a hot shot is it a fire jumper? Hot shot? Firefighter. Hot shot firefighter does. How many of you know what a hot shot firefighter does? Anyone? Whoever does is going to get multiple rubber chickens. Multiple rubber chickens. All right. So hot shots rappel from helicopters onto the side of mountains into fires. And they hike into where sometimes it's too dangerous for smoke jumpers to parachute into. And the more dangerous the terrain, the higher the likelihood that a hotshot fire crew will be deployed to fight the fire. It's dangerous. It's challenging to qualify for. The physical and mental requirements, you might think of it like almost like special forces, but the firepower comes from flames versus weapons. And Michael was a hotshot firefighter. And that is really interesting because it informs a lot of his decisions in ways that might be different as he moved into the high stakes Silicon Valley tech sales and then became a world-class coach. So we're going to be able to get all kinds of nuggets from Michael about how these different experiences, and he's got some other crazy experiences because he's a little crazy, in terms of subjecting himself to extreme things, how these things have affected his decision making. So Michael, fights, fires. So fights, fires, we've got fights, fires. Wow. Yeah. So people are saying fights, fires. Wow. All right. You have to, so be sure to bring your questions. Michael, when you're not fighting fires or fighting for the sanity and good ideas for your clients, what else do you do?
I have been known to enjoy skiing, and usually the more extreme, the more fun for me. So when my wife and I go up to the mountain, we tend to ski together for maybe an hour, maybe two, and then we part ways so we can both have a good time.
All right. Are you the kind of skier that skis with an avalanche pack?
I've done it before. Yeah, I've done that. Yeah, that's a little like that even pushes the limits of what I think is fun. Yeah.
All right. And all right. So here's my question. Let's welcome a few other good thinkers in, because we've got, let's see, Kumar from India, Pankaj. I'm horrible at pronouncing names. Plus I have to see, so it's hard. And we've got Animesh, also from India. So we've got a great group of people here that can probe you with questions. But let me start by asking a very clear question, which is, do you have kind of a piece of advice that in all the decision-making roles that you currently work in and currently deal with, do you have a unique piece of advice that you wouldn't have if you hadn't been a hotshot firefighter?
Yeah. I would like to maybe turn it around with a question here. And this can be a question for you. It can be a question for the audience. I would love to hear some participation on this. And let's use an example that maybe most people might be familiar with. And that is, a few years ago, there was at least in North America, a pretty famous incident involving a commercial aircraft where there was a Captain Sully, who's now a very famous person, because his aircraft flew into a flock of birds and both engines failed. And the question is, what do you suppose Captain Sully considered when making the decision to land a commercial aircraft in the Hudson River and ultimately save the lives of everyone on board? What were some of the elements, do you think, that he used or took into consideration when making that split-second decision to go land a plane in the Hudson River versus try to make it to the nearest airport?
Does anyone have? Okay, I'm not going to say. I'm just going to welcome more people in. I'm going to say Matt Fitzgibbons, Syracuse, go Orange. We'll see about that. Welcome. Does anyone have any ideas about, are you talking about kind of what he considered as part of his decision process?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Are you asking for the top consideration, or are you asking for, how should we think about answering this question?
Yeah, this is a pretty open-ended question on purpose.
Okay.
Because I want to engage with people on, when the stakes are high, perhaps. I mean, hopefully we're never in that kind of a decision. But throughout our lives, we're in, places and situations where we're given the opportunity to make decisions. And this is an extreme example. And so I think a lot of these extreme examples can hold nuggets to like how we can make more effective and better decisions in everyday life, in our work, in finances, with family, with a lot of different scenarios. So
we're getting some good answers.
Okay,
so
cool.
I want to bring some in.
Yes.
Because Loya says he used his intuition, and I'm so glad you said that, because we're going to touch on that a lot, I'm sure. Yeah. Paul says distance, speed, damage. Oh, I like those kind of checklist things. Mm-hmm. Stephen says perhaps considering the risk to passengers versus the risk to people outside the plane. And let's see. We've got the plane might not make it, so many things can happen. Absolutely. We've got people thinking, whatever. I want to ask you, I want to queue up one thing as people put their great answers. And I think all really worthwhile answers in the chat. Heuristics. Vinay says heuristics. Absolutely. And I think these are, I mean, this is great. Okay, Matt, excited to be here. Excited to have you here. All right. So this is my question. When, you think about all of these things and you, maybe you're looking at heuristics, maybe you're looking at intuition. This speaks to a little bit to Captain Sully's background. I don't know if current pilots have, on average, the same kind of military flying experience that a commercial pilot of Captain Sully's generation might have. Do you know the answer to that? Do you know whether current pilots have the same level of military experience as they used to?
I don't. I'm not sure. Yeah.
My guess is that they don't. That is just conjecture. And because there's a lot of flight simulation software and tools that didn't exist to the same degree back when Captain Sully was trained. So I wonder if perhaps when you look at the conditions for intuition, for example, which I call it REF, in my courses, I talk about intuition being, you need your personal intuition referee. So a system is regular, you have enough exposure, and you get immediate feedback. I'm not sure that the conditions in that would be amenable to or wise to use intuition in that case, because there's so much, it's not a regular closed system. Certainly a lot of exposure. I think he had a high level of exposure. I don't think immediate feedback would be great because, you might be, if your feedback is, oops, made the wrong decision, boom, you're not repeating that mistake again, most likely. Yeah. What do you think? How would you answer that?
Yeah, I would answer this related to my experience on the Hot Shot Fire crew. And so if you can imagine taking a group of 20 individuals and putting them on a crew, and probably not many of them know each other on day one, there's a 2-week intense training that starts. And right away, you've got to create a foundational element of knowledge, like basic knowledge, to make a decision in the container of like fighting a fire. And so the knowledge is like how to dig your fire line, how to be safe when using a chainsaw, how to rappel out of a helicopter, right? These are very much like how-to things, like the basics, right? And so for 2 weeks, we got to do the basics. Also in those 2 weeks, we created an environment where we got to fail in relatively safe conditions. And I just chalk that up to, I like to call that repetition, right? So we were putting in the reps in conditions that weren't as dangerous, right? And so I would be out digging fire line and I would have a crew boss yelling at me, Michael, which direction is the wind coming from? Michael, where's your safety escape route? These kinds of things, right? And I would get flustered and I would fail over and over and over and question myself. But I got better, right? I got better at making those split-second decisions in an environment that wasn't inherently that dangerous. And then the third element doesn't happen until we actually got out on the fire. And that's the experience. That's the situational awareness. That's the ability to assess and make decisions based on your training, your discipline, and what's happening in real time around you right now. And so that's kind of the three things that I think are important, whether you're making a decision on the fire line or crash landing an aircraft, or deciding on which employee you're going to hire, or what to do with, making investment decisions, right? You've got to have the basic knowledge, the basic foundation. Ideally, you're able to fail in safe conditions, make decisions before actually being in a situation that would be dangerous potentially, and then get out in there and start having some experience, gathering some experience. And that's the tricky one, because you can't get that unless you get out there and like actually gain the experience, right?
That is so true. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question of you and the audience to see because this reminds me of UDA, which is, I think it was Air Force Colonel John Boyd came up with this for the US military, which was observe, orient, decide, act. And I think that model is interesting. So my question to you all, and then I'll ask Michael too what he thinks. Well, first of all, so you're saying that when you were kind of practicing and your head guy was saying, Michael, which way is the wind? Michael, where's your fire escape? That is kind of practicing the observe.
Yeah.
And then the orient, how would you describe the orient process and then the deciding and acting? And while you're describing that, let us know in the chat, good thinkers, whether you think, miracle on the Hudson, so true, whether you think that the observation, the orientation, the deciding, or the acting, which by the way is a loop. It's not a start to end. It's a loop because you keep having to do that. What do you think is the most important of the 4 components of OODA? And then, I mean, it's just a way to kind of think about it. And then I'm curious what you think and how you would describe the orienting part, because that's the part that's kind of confusing to me.
Yeah. Oh man, the orienting part. Well, in the context of fighting a fire, the orienting part for me feels more like really what's my current situation? Where is the wind coming from?
Mm-hmm.
How, what's the environment? Like, are we in trees? Are we in brush? I need to orient myself ahead of time to be able to know what decision to make and what action to take. So that orientation is actually, I would say, the most important part in being on a fire line in the middle of a forest fire. Because without the orientation, I could make a bad decision and I could have a bad outcome, I could take a very bad action.
Well, so I think Jennifer agrees with you. She says maybe orientation because it incorporates awareness of everything. I think that's a good point that you were touching on, because fighting a fire and orienting around how a fire behaves is very different than orienting around how humans behave, like in a market or launching a product or even in a medical decision. How you react to your doctor and orienting yourself around that is very different than how you orient around a virus. And I think that's one of the challenges we have right now with, this pandemic is we want to orient ourselves like we would, in fighting humans in a war, for example. But if you applied fighting humans in a war to firefighting, you wouldn't be considering how a fire reacts. You'd be considering how a human brain reacts. And that may be more analogous to fighting a virus. We still try to apply these same kinds of orienting techniques. And it's why we're confused. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's easy to be confused. And if you don't, I think that's where a lot of the experience, whether it's Captain Sully or fighting a fire, come into play. Because if you were to take someone out of their 2 weeks of fire training and unforeseen circumstances would place them in a bad situation. For example, we all had to wear a backpack with certain tools and something called a fire shelter, was something could be deployed quickly, you could cover, and the idea was that you could survive a fire kind of blowing over you. But the reality is the survival rate of using those was less than 10%. Yet safety standards required that we learn how to use it and that we carry it at all times. So in a moment of panic, you might say, oh, I need to deploy the fire shelter. But that's one of the worst decisions that you could make.
Why is that?
As a firefighter, because you've only got about a 10% chance of surviving. And there are so many other better options than using the fire shelter. However, that's the thing that we're required to carry on our back. And that's the thing we're taught how to deploy quickly. But fortunately, we were also taught other options. And the other options weren't they just weren't inherently obvious, even to someone that was trained on the basics. Like you would think if you were kind of in a canyon and there was a lot of sparks and fire and chaos, your human instinct is probably to run kind of uphill away from the current situation. That's also one of the worst things that you can do. The better
Why is that?
Because in most fires, you get kind of an updraft effect, and the fire and the wind carries uphill faster than a human can run.
Well,
and so,
all right, keep going. Sorry.
yeah, and so you would very likely get overtaken by heat or smoke inhalation or both.
Well, this question from Joshua kind of relates with how could he minimize damage to the plane? That may or may not have been a major consideration. I mean, it's about, so that may be like way down in even though it's a monetary consideration, it might take, kind of drop down in precedence for that kind of decision making. Jennifer says, who requires you to wear the fire shelter? It really doesn't work. If it really doesn't work, why carry that thing?
Exactly. Well, it was a mandated government requirement, and it was mandated for all kinds or all types of firefighters. And so we were in generally more dangerous circumstances than most firefighters. We still had to carry one because it was mandated, but we were essentially taught that we would never use the fire shelter. Other firefighters in other less harmful conditions may actually be able to deploy that fire shelter and, may be able to use it. But in our situations that we were in, we still had to carry it. It was like, it was one of those haha jokes, like we carry this extra weight that we will never use, right?
And we have a lot of those in our business decision making, where we have regulations, reasons for things that might be obtuse to us, laws or rules within the company that you have to adhere to that don't make sense. And maybe for the people making that decision, it makes a lot of sense, but not for the people actually using the tools. I mean, that's where there's this need to have enough cross-pollination so that you can understand the perspectives of the actual people. Like you say, okay, people who fight fires need this. Well, maybe not hotshot firefighters. So I wonder about those, how many of you have those kinds of things in your own organization where you have these rules and regulations and you think with pretty intense certainty that they're bogus and they get in the way of you doing your job rather than making you more efficient. How many of you have experienced those things in your own work? That's what I'm curious about. Like, I'd be more curious, like, how many of you haven't? And sometimes it's a function of just not understanding. Sometimes it's always a function of not understanding, but at what level? And how did were you tempted to not carry those kinds of things on your back? Was it tempting to say, let's leave it, it's an impediment? Or that's not an option? All right. Okay. So when you think of decision making, how much of the decision making is made or done or kind of gone through before the decision has to be made? Like, how do you think about that? And maybe how is it different when you're making a decision to do some kind of extreme endurance sports like you do, fighting crazy fires, or even when you were working in Silicon Valley in software sales? And we'll get to how it relates to your incredible coaching techniques, but how much of the decision process is done before you even have to make that decision?
Yeah, I would say, and this is a off the cuff answer, but I would say most of it. I would say 90%. Yeah. There's about 10% of it that's situational awareness of what's happening and what's happening around me. What are the current conditions? But I would say that most of it comes before. And, in some of the trail runs that I've done, there's so much that can and probably will go wrong during a race that you can't predict. You might get a severe leg cramp, or you might trip on a route and, do a face plant on the trail. You might get a little bit dehydrated, right? So you've got to make all these, you've got these conditions that are possible. And I like to think of it from the perspective of, if you're going to do something like that, it's not a matter of if something's going to go wrong. It's a matter of what. it's going to be. And so you do your best to prepare and carry all this stuff, but even making mental decisions ahead of time, like, okay, if I do trip and fall on a route, like what are the conditions such that I would get up and continue the race versus not? And a small part of that is like situational, in the moment. If I have a compound fracture, clearly I'm not going to go anywhere, right? But if I'm bruised and my ego is bruised a little bit, and I've dedicated myself to finishing the race, then when something gets tough, I've already made a conscious decision ahead of time to keep going. And hopefully I'm carrying a first aid kit so that if I get a scratch or something like that, I can take appropriate action. I can still finish the race that I trained for.
Is it tempting to ignore the decisions that you've made ahead of time in the moment? And what kind of techniques, mental techniques, checklists that do you create for making sure you don't ignore the wise decisions you made ahead of time? And I'll say, Jawad, welcome. Jawad's here. We got to say hi to Jawad. And we've got to say, let's see what Matt says, because he always has great things to say. Observation, because it gives you information to orient. Okay, so he's going back to which is most important. And those are those two O's are very related. Notice no one says decisions and no one says act.
Yeah.
That tells you, hint, hint, the decision process is more important than the decision itself. Ha ha. All right. Yes. So back to your, we're like, it's going so fast and we've got so much to talk about. Maybe you'll do a round two. How do you prevent yourself from ignoring the decisions you made ahead of time?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, because in a business deal that you get 80% of the way through and stuff kind of starts to go sideways, but you've invested so much time and energy and you just want to see it through, even though there's these red lights flashing, like exit now, walk away. This is going to get worse, not better. It's similar when you're running a trail race, right? Because there's adrenaline in your body and you might trip and fall and do something bad to your leg. And I think knowing that you've made a decision ahead of time that under no circumstances will I continue the race if I can know that it's going to jeopardize my ability to run, walk, enjoy life further, right? So if I'm 15 miles into a trail race and I trip on a route and I have a laceration in my leg and it's very hard to walk, the adrenaline might actually kick in and my competitive spirit and say, you know what? I committed to this race ahead of time. I'm going to keep going. I've only got 6 miles left. But the other side of my brain, or the other piece that I think has to be active, is like, wait a minute. I want this to be a sustainable sport. I don't want to finish this race and then limp for the rest of my life because I've done irreparable damage to my leg, right? So it's a bit of a situational thing, I think. The important thing is like having made decisions ahead of time, knowing to the best of your ability, like how will I react if and when the worst case situation or some version of that happens.
So the simple tool that I think is interesting to think about is the sunk cost opportunity cost conundrum. And if people say, well, how do you make that? I mean, it's easy to talk about in theory, but let's get to practical use. And I say, okay, let's say you're going to a movie. And back in the days we went to theaters, maybe we never will again, but let's just say you decide to watch a movie and you say, I'm going to give this movie no more than 10 minutes. If after 10 minutes, I don't think this movie is good, no matter what, I'm going to get up and leave, because number one, I'm going to focus on the fact that I've already paid for this movie. I've already spent 10 minutes or plus preview, trailers or whatever, maybe another half an hour, so 40 minutes. But that opportunity cost of what else I could be doing is going to be worth it. So if you can go through that ahead of time, where you really identify the sunk costs you're willing to walk away from and identify the opportunity costs that you can get back if you do ignore that sunk cost, that to me is a really good, good use of your how to think muscle. And I'm sure that when life and death situations are, when life is on the line, that's a no-brainer. it's a sunk cost that we've walked this far. The fire is chasing us. We've got to make that decision. I think about that guy. I don't know when it was, but was it the Oregon fires or the California fires, where he dug like a circle around himself, or he lit a fire around himself or something. And I think, is that even something that was practiced, or was that taking lessons from one context to the next and applying it? I mean, there's so much that goes into that kind of decision making. Do you know what I'm talking about with that example?
I don't. I'm not familiar with that story.
Oh, okay. Well, Jennifer, let's see what we've got here. Jennifer says, like thinking through an earthquake, where would we go and grab in 2 seconds you have? It is so interesting during the most recent fires on the West Coast, how many people were scrounging to get, the materials, the water, whatever. And I'm not saying you have to be, a survivalist, whatever, but it's pretty easy to talk about reacting. When an earthquake comes, we should really get our go bags ready. When an earthquake comes, we should really get our go bags ready. Well, what's preventing you from getting your go bag ready? That we live in a big earthquake zone, so that's relative. Well, what's the equivalent of, what do you guys think? And I'll ask Michael too. What's the equivalent as an entrepreneur? Because we're going to pivot to coaching, because that's really where all of your great thinking tools have landed you, and to the benefit of your massively lucky clients. What is the equivalent of a go bag for an entrepreneur? What do you guys think? Michael will answer, but what do you think? Like, one thing you think you should have ready? That's a hard question. That's why I'm posing it. I'll pose it to Michael. You answer, because we've only got a few minutes. So I want to make sure we get to some of your nuggets.
Yeah. So one of the things in my go-to bag as an entrepreneur, and I can't remember who I would credit with saying this, but this kind of summarizes the idea, is that how can you create the relationships that you need to have as an entrepreneur, like 2 to 5 years before you need them? Mm-hmm. How do you cultivate that? Because any of the great startups that I've worked for, and the founders of those startups, they're highly resourceful because they've put in effort, energy, they've built relationship capital to the point where, if you need your lead software developer quits or has some kind of an emergency, what do? The most resourced entrepreneurs and founders that I know always win in that situation, because they call their friends across the valley and they say, hey, I need a lead software developer like yesterday. Who do you recommend? And in that scenario, they've got the person by the end of the week in the job. So it's building and cultivating relationships before you need them.
That is so true, because building and cultivating relationships the day after you've gotten laid off is going to be a lot harder, because you're going to feel desperate. You're going to feel the fire kind of coming at you. You're going to feel the twig sticking in your leg from the fall on the trail. So if you consider building those, I would say, friendships, not even transactional, filling that makes total sense. The day to create your LinkedIn profile and start engaging is not the day after your pink slip arrives in your hand, is not the day after you were laid off. Susume says pen and paper. And that is really good, because sometimes just that good old fashioned, just writing things down and making those connections. Frankly, I'm going to take it a step further. One thing that you did that I think is incredible is, you write letters, like you write thank you letters, like old fashioned thank you letters. And they're brilliant, and they break kind of the monotony of, A, forgetting to write thank you letters, B, forgetting to send a thank you email. And it's really, and you do it in addition. So let me see. What does Susume say? He says, unless we write what we think, critical thinking may not be effective. Actually, he's right. Don't listen to Susume, not Socrates, because Socrates thought, do not write things down. He thought it was lazy. And he thought only by discourse, public oratory discourse, can you advance your thoughts and ideas. maybe there's a balance there. Maybe tweeting isn't the best way, but writing things down. And we have, let's see, totally agree. So I totally agree with you about developing your relationships. All right. What is one more, as we wrap up, we're going a little longer, but that's okay. We didn't even get to half the stuff I wanted to ask you about. But if you could share one story of how coaching challenged you to be a better thinker, that we could take away nuggets. Can you share?
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's so many good examples. I can specifically remember an example where I had a sales coach who was actually, he was disguised as a sales coach. He was a very highly skillful and talented coach, period. I hesitate to say the word life coach or phrase life coach because it was far more than that. But I remember I was in a toxic work environment at a high flying startup that had a super hot product in a hot market. And the culture was highly toxic. And I remember thinking, like, I had pre-IPO shares. I was like, should I stick it out? Mm-hmm. Should I just stay and figure out how to navigate the stress and the chaos and the unhappiness? And this coach, he basically, asked me, how do you estimate your value in terms of your days and your life? Like, how important is that to you? Mm-hmm. Right? And I'm like, my quality of life, you can't put a price on it. Like, it's really high, right? And so, without going into all the details, I made a decision to leave that company and join another startup that was like a less prominent player in the market, but they had a really great team culture. And that company went on to become a far greater, higher valued company. I ended up receiving far more personal experiential learning, satisfaction, career satisfaction, which spilled over into life satisfaction, and ultimately probably just as much or more, money that was made for me personally on joining that second company, leaving the first one and joining the second one. So that was more of a career life decision. And I never forget the guidance from that coach, just asking me simply, like, what's important to you? Because it forced me to think about how I spend my time and my energy and my days, and know that I could have stayed in a position of just doing the status quo, right? That's always tends to be the easiest for us humans. We're like the frog that gets boiled slowly, and next thing you know, we're dead. But he forced me to make a decision, and he allowed me to make it, right? All he did was ask me some really powerful questions, and I'll never forget that. That was a turning point in my career.
If someone is watching this now live or coming in later, how do they know if they should, number one, hire a coach, and number two, more specifically, and I know you have a limited number of people, clients that you can take and all that, but how do they know if they should A, hire a coach, or B, specifically, and I would be more specific, hire you? Because you're a weird kind of coach.
A weird kind of coach.
I say that because you are not all things to all people. And to me, that's unusual and highly valued. So can you give us a little bit about how someone will be listening to this and saying, he's the right one for me? Or not.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a career coach, so I'm not going to be the best person to hire to guide you into a promotion or switching from one role in a company to another. There's lots of great executive coaches that I know, and I'm happy to refer you to if you're interested in something like that. But I enjoy being a coach for people who have an idea or ideas, and it can be within the realm of maybe their own company, or maybe more of an entrepreneurial idea that you want to validate and that you want to monetize. You want to turn it into something that generates revenue and also creates the impact, because usually those ideas are driven more by impact than they are financial rewards. The financial rewards come as a result of executing on delivering the impact. And so, anyone who's good at something and they want to take that something and create value in the marketplace, that's my jam. I love doing that. I love coaching people through all of the doubts and chaos and decisions that are involved with taking an idea or maybe something that's already existing and bringing it to the next level. That's what I love to do.
I think that's totally clear. So if any of you, is that any of you? Do any of you have an idea that you'd love to monetize? And I would probably, if you can answer now, great. If not, we will definitely be looking at the comments after the live stream and trying to respond. How do people get a hold of you?
Super simple. Email me at Michael, Michael, at Michael Knouse. My last name is spelled Knouse, Michael at michaelknouse.com.
And can they also link in with you and maybe send you a message through LinkedIn?
They can absolutely send me a message through LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. Yeah.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thank you, good thinkers. Thank you, Michael, for being here. I love that every week we have just a little bit of time. We're supposed to be like 30 minutes, but we're going over 40, but get greedy for Michael's time. Just a little bit of time to steal away from all the time we spend on what to think, to luxuriate and give our brains, which our brains deserve it, don't they? Don't our brains deserve it? To give our brains a chance to work on improving how to think. So thank you so much for being here. You are awesome. And maybe I can even rope you in for round 2 at some point in time.
That would be fun.
Let me know if you guys want Michael for round 2, because we barely even scratched the surface of decision making. Anyway, thank you all for being here. And I hope you guys have a great, great week.